The sky over northern France was a pale, metallic blue, cold, silent, endless. But beneath it, the air trembled with thunder. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses crawled toward the horizon, silver giants glinting in the morning light, each one shaking under the pulse of flak bursting in black clouds around them. Inside one of them, a veteran called Lucky Lass, a single burst shattered the calm. The tail section rattled violently. The gunner shouted something no one could hear over the roar. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage like a swarm of angry bees. The intercom went dead. And for a few long seconds, every man aboard thought their fortress had finally met its end. The tail gunner's position was nearly gone, ripped apart by cannon shells, a gaping wound of twisted aluminum and shredded plexiglass. The gunner was bleeding, half-conscious, his world now a frozen tunnel of air and fear. There was no time to turn back. The mission had to continue. Somehow, against every law of aerodynamics and mercy, the flying fortress stayed in the air. When they finally landed back in England, the crew stepped out in silence. Around the battered tail, the ground mechanics gathered, men with grease-stained hands and hollow eyes who had seen too many returns like this. One looked at the wreckage and muttered, "We can't keep patching her like this." Another replied, "Then we'll build her a wall." It began as a joke. It ended as an idea that would quietly change how men survived the air war over Europe. Because from that day forward, across muddy airfields scattered through East Anglia, men began to break the rules. They stripped metal from wrecked planes, scavenged armor plates from tanks, cut, welded, and bolted them around the tail sections of B-17s, illegally, without orders, without permission. They weren't engineers. They were survivors. And what they built would save lives before the brass even knew it existed. This is the untold story of how desperate ingenuity transformed the flying fortress into something even more formidable. How, in the crucible of war, men discovered that survival itself could be an art form. By the spring of 1943, the daylight bombing campaign over Europe had become a ritual of attrition. Every mission was a roll of dice. Every man aboard a B-17 knew his odds. The Luftwaffe ruled the high air and German flak filled the rest. For the 8th Air Force it was Black Thursday, every week. In the 303rd, 305th and 306th bomb groups, crews measured survival not in missions completed, but in the simple act of returning. A B-17 could take punishment, yes. It could lose engines, wings, even half its tail and still limp home, but even legends have weak spots. The nose, the belly, the tail. Especially the tail. The tail gunner station was a coffin of thin aluminum, isolated from the crew by a narrow crawlway. Two Browning .50 caliber guns faced backward, daring the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that attacked from the 6 o'clock. But the gunner himself? He sat behind a layer of plexiglass and faith. They called it the loneliest seat in the sky. Statistically, it was also the deadliest. When a B-17 went down, the tail gunner had the lowest chance of making it out alive. For the ground crews, those silent guardians of the bomb groups, that wasn't acceptable. They weren't officers or strategists. They were farm boys turned mechanics, machinists turned miracle workers. Their orders were simple: repair what was broken. But they'd seen too many good men come home in stretchers or not at all. One mechanic from the 91st Bomb Group later recalled, "We started scavenging anything with metal left. If a tank came in busted, we peeled it like an onion. Bolts, plates, brackets, didn't matter if it was Army or Air Corps, we were all fighting the same damn war." So they welded strips of salvaged tank armor around the tail turret, rough, uneven, ugly. The added weight threw off the balance. The drag slowed the fortress down. Command hated it. But it worked. The planes that came back with those crude reinforcements showed fewer dead gunners. The Air Force called it unauthorized modification. The men who built it called it insurance. The B-17 was already a miracle of American engineering, a machine born to absorb punishment and still fly. Its legend was written in bullet holes and smoke trails across the skies of Germany. But even legends bleed. The enemy had adapted. By late 1943, Luftwaffe pilots had learned the fortress's weak points. They dove from above and behind, pouring 20mm shells into the tail first, tearing it open before the crew even knew they were under attack. The brass in Washington saw statistics, acceptable losses for strategic progress. The men on the ground saw faces. On an East Anglia airfield, one crew chief, Sergeant William Red Hanley, decided he wasn't waiting for permission. He'd lost 2 gunners in a month. The next time his B-17, Hell's Bell, limped home with its tail nearly shredded, he rolled her into the hangar, shut the doors and went to work. It took 2 nights. He and his team welded armor plates cut from a wrecked British Churchill tank, using lanterns for light and silence for cover. When the officers saw it, they nearly court-martialed him. But that afternoon, Hell's Bell flew another mission. She came back. And so did her gunner. Word spread fast through the bases. Crews began trading scraps like currency. Mechanics learned which wrecks had the thickest steel, which bolts fit which tail cone. They called it field armor, and though it broke regulations, it saved lives. Each night, as engines cooled and the airfield went dark, you could hear the faint hiss of acetylene torches somewhere in the hangars, men quietly reshaping the odds of survival with their own hands. It wasn't rebellion. It was resilience. These men weren't defying command, they were defying death itself. And as the missions grew longer and the losses heavier, their ingenuity became an underground movement, an invisible network of field innovation. Every base had its own signature. Some bolted steel around the tail dome. Others layered aluminum from destroyed wings beneath the gunner's seat. A few even reinforced the inside walls with sections of tank tread, just to buy the gunner a few more seconds when the shells came in. It was ugly. It was heavy. But it worked. Inspectors soon noticed. Planes were returning with strange shapes, lumpy tails, jagged patches, crude armor that looked more medieval than modern. Official reports called them unauthorized and aerodynamically detrimental. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. The patched-up fortresses were surviving more often. And somewhere, far from the mud and noise of those airfields, engineers at Boeing began to listen. They studied the battered planes that made it home, noting the crude reinforcements, the strange weld lines, the extra plates that pilots swore had saved their crews. What they saw in those rough scars wasn't disorder, it was innovation born not in a lab but in desperation. The story of how those forbidden repairs evolved into official design changes, how the voice of mechanics and gunners shaped the steel skeleton of the flying fortress itself, begins not with a general or a factory, but with the quiet courage of men who refused to lose another friend. The quiet courage of men who refused to lose another friend would soon ripple far beyond the muddy runways of England. At first, Boeing engineers thought the reports were exaggerations. Tales of field armor and scrap metal fixes sounded like folklore passed between bases. But when the wrecks began arriving in Seattle for analysis, the evidence was undeniable. The tail sections were thicker, heavier, patched with crude metal that didn't belong there, and yet they had held. The damage patterns told their own story. Shells that might have torn a tail clean off had instead stopped short, deflected by plates cut from tanks or even spare landing gear doors. These makeshift defenses, ugly as they were, had saved men's lives. And so, what began as defiance quietly became data. Back in Europe, the crews kept flying. The air war was evolving faster than any manual could be printed. Germany's defenses grew deadlier, their flak more precise, their fighters more coordinated. The bombers answered not with new tactics, but with grit and the quiet rebellion of their mechanics. Every mission was a lesson written in metal. Each hole patch told a story about where the enemy aimed, what failed, and what could be changed. The B-17 was more than a bomber now, it was a floating laboratory of survival, redesigned in real time by men with nothing to lose. In hangars dimly lit by single bulbs, these men worked miracles. They used whatever they could find, tank skirts from disabled Shermans, armor fragments from wrecked half-tracks, even the thick plating of crashed enemy planes. Sometimes they melted down fragments and poured new sheets. Sometimes they hammered old ones back into shape. They didn't wait for authorization because in war, time was measured in funerals. Each night was a race to keep another crew alive by dawn. One mechanic later said, "It wasn't about breaking rules. It was about making sure those rules didn't bury our boys." That sentiment echoed across every airfield. Pilots trusted them completely. Crews would come in with their fortresses torn apart, Parker, and walk away saying, "Do what you have to do, Chief." And they did. The next morning, that same aircraft would roll out again, uglier, heavier, patched with steel and courage, and take off for Germany once more. By mid-1943, survival rates began to change. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. But the numbers whispered the truth. Fortresses returning with improvised armor around the tail reported fewer fatal hits to the gunner's position. Some bases noticed their loss rates drop by as much as 30%. That was enough to draw attention from the top. The Air Force began to send technical teams to investigate. Official memos called these field modifications unacceptable deviations from standard. Yet the inspectors could see what everyone else already knew. The men who bent the rules were saving lives the manuals couldn't. In the air, those same fortresses were carving their legend. The gunners inside the patched tails began to fight differently. They had confidence now, a sense that the steel behind them might hold even for a moment longer. And in the split second between life and death, a moment was everything. Crews began returning from missions with their tails shot to ribbons but intact enough to bring them home. Pilots swore they could feel the difference. The planes felt heavier, yes, but somehow sturdier, as if the souls of every mechanic who touched her were welded into the frame. The Luftwaffe noticed too. Fighter pilots reported that American bombers seemed harder to finish off, more stubborn in the air. They fly through fire, one German ace wrote in his diary, as if they were made of stone. But they weren't made of stone. They were made of scraps, sweat, and willpower. Meanwhile, Boeing's engineers studied the wrecks that came home. They measured the thickness of tail armor, the impact points of enemy shells, the distribution of weight. Slowly they realized something radical. These field mechanics had done what the design bureau hadn't yet dared to do. They'd adapted faster than the system. The engineers began incorporating thicker tail plating into the production line. Reinforced bulkheads. Additional armor sheets beneath the gunner's seat. Even the iconic tail gun blister was slightly reshaped to deflect rounds rather than absorb them. But back on the front lines, the men didn't know they were changing aviation history. They were just trying to get through another day. The missions to Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen pushed the bomb groups to the breaking point. The enemy's flak was so dense it looked like you could walk on it. Crews described the sky as a black ocean of smoke and fire. Engines tore free from wings. Bomb bays burned mid-flight. The tail gunners, locked in their transparent prisons, watched their friends die and kept firing. For many, those armor plates meant the difference between being blown apart and coming home with scars. There were stories whispered among the squadrons, legends of impossible survivals. One B-17 returned with its tail nearly sawed in half, held together by the welds of salvaged tank metal. Another came back with a cannon shell embedded in its makeshift armor, stopped inches from the gunner's back. When they pried it out, they found it had jammed between two mismatched steel plates, one from a Sherman, one from a German Panzer. Ironically, the enemy's own armor had saved an American life. For every miracle that made it home, a dozen fortresses didn't. But those that did carried more than bombs. They carried proof. Proof that survival wasn't just luck. It was engineered by human hands in the shadows of hangars and under the threat of court-martial. The culture of defiance spread like quiet fire. Mechanics began leaving spare armor plates hidden under tarps for other crews to borrow. Gunners compared notes, sketching diagrams of new reinforcements on the backs of ration boxes. Innovation became a whispering network, carried not by orders but by trust. Yet not everyone approved. Higher command saw risk in chaos. Unauthorized modifications could compromise flight performance, they argued. Extra weight could mean slower climbs, higher fuel consumption, and shorter range. But the crews laughed bitterly at the idea of range. For them, a bomber's range ended wherever the flak began. Survival came first and paperwork came later, if they were lucky enough to fill it out. The balance between order and adaptation had always defined war. In the air over Europe, that balance tilted toward the men who refused to wait for permission to save themselves. And as the summer of 1943 turned to autumn, the ingenuity of these mechanics began to merge with the official evolution of the B-17 itself. The G model was on the horizon, a version born from lessons written in fire. It carried factory-installed armor around the tail and belly, thicker glass in the nose, and a new turret design inspired, in part, by the very field modifications Washington had once forbidden. The men on the line noticed. When the first B-17GS arrived, shiny in uniform, the crews gathered around them in silence. They saw something familiar in the curves and welds, a reflection of their own defiance now stamped into metal by the hands of Boeing engineers. One mechanic said softly, "Looks like they finally caught up to us." The others nodded. There was no celebration, just quiet pride. Because every bolt, every rivet in that new design had been bought with sweat and blood in the fields of England. Still, innovation didn't stop. Even with improved armor, danger evolved. German fighters introduced heavier guns, new ammunition, even rocket attacks. Each new threat demanded another answer. The cycle of survival continued. The field crews adapted faster than any design office could. When enemy pilots learned to aim for the wings, crews reinforced the leading edges. When flak grew deadlier, they lined the radio compartment with layered aluminum. Survival wasn't a science anymore, it was instinct. Each flight was an experiment conducted in real time. Each return was a lesson. Each burned-out fortress became a teacher. Mechanics studied wrecks like surgeons studying cadavers. They traced every bullet hole, every scorch mark, asking themselves, what can we change? It wasn't official policy. It was human evolution under fire. Through it all, the bond between aircrew and ground crew deepened beyond words. Pilots trusted their mechanics with their lives because those mechanics had already risked theirs in another way, by breaking rules. Before takeoff, the crews would pat the fuselage, whispering thanks to the men who had rebuilt her. And after landing, when the plane rolled and smoking and torn but alive, those same men would be waiting, tools in hand, ready to bring her back from the dead once again. No medal was ever issued for this kind of courage. No official recognition came for the men who welded tank steel to bomber tails in the dark. But every life saved was proof enough. In a war that demanded obedience, they found freedom through invention. And in doing so, they reminded the world that survival is not just an act of endurance, it's an act of creation. As the fog settled over the English fields and the sound of engines faded into silence, the mechanics cleaned their hands, wiped the soot from their faces, and looked at their patched-up fortresses lined along the runway. Each one bore the marks of human hands, scars of ingenuity. The brass might call it unauthorized. History would call it genius. And high above, where the cold air thinned and the contrails stretched across the sky, the gunners in those fortified tails sat a little straighter, breathed a little easier, and held the line a little longer. Because they knew that down below, someone had built them a shield, not out of orders but out of love and defiance. By late 1943, something remarkable was happening across the 8th Air Force. Mechanics and air crews had begun sharing photographs, sketches, and stories of these improvised B-17 modifications. A small cult of ingenuity was forming, passed between squadrons like whispers in a monastery. One man would hear of a tail gunner saved by his welded plate and think, maybe I should try that too. Soon it wasn't just armor, it was a movement. But unofficial innovation walks a thin line. The U.S. Army Air Forces had regulations forbidding unauthorized alterations to aircraft. Boeing engineers warned that adding excess weight in the rear could throw off the bomber's balance, making it harder to control. Maintenance officers worried about the ripple effects on airframe stress. Yet, for men who watched friends burn alive or vanish into clouds of tracer fire, the risk of bending a rule meant nothing compared to the risk of dying tomorrow. Inside the cold hangars of England's bomber stations, after the official day's work ended, lamps stayed on. Shadows moved between engines and fuselages. The smell of hot steel mixed with oil. Mechanics borrowed tools, scavenged fragments of destroyed aircraft, even pieces of enemy wreckage, hammering and riveting through the night. They built armor like blacksmiths of the air. Some crews went further. One team at Thorpe Abbott stripped armor from a destroyed P-47 Thunderbolt and refitted it around their B-17's nose, calling it the Flying Fortress for real this time. Another crew took scrap from a crashed Sherman tank and bolted a panel right under the cockpit floor. If Jerry's going to aim for our guts, we might as well give him something to hit, their pilot said. Each modification was unique, an evolving patchwork of defiance. Then came the missions where those changes proved their worth. Tail gunners who once felt naked against Focke-Wulfs now survived head-on passes. Crews returned with stories of cannon shells that hit the welded plates and failed to penetrate. Ground crews began collecting the evidence: bent fragments, impact marks, photos of holes that stopped halfway. The data was anecdotal but undeniable. Survival rates for these modified aircraft were roughly double those of unmodified ones. At first, higher command didn't know what to do with this information. It was unofficial, technically insubordinate, yet too successful to ignore. Boeing engineers, flown in from Seattle to inspect damaged aircraft, noticed the odd configurations and makeshift armor. "Who did this?" one of them asked. The mechanic shrugged. "The guys who wanted to come home." Boeing's reports described these changes as field adaptations born from necessity. But beneath the corporate tone there was something else: admiration. The B-17 had been built as a fortress, but the men inside it had redefined what that meant. They weren't just using a machine, they were evolving it piece by piece under fire. Meanwhile, in the skies above Germany, the Luftwaffe was noticing too. Fighter pilots who once attacked from the rear began to shift tactics. Their intelligence reports mentioned American bombers now heavily armored in the tail. German engineers even speculated that the US was secretly producing a new variant of the B-17 with reinforced armor. They were wrong, it was simply the creativity of desperate men. Back in England, this quiet arms race continued in shadows. Each mission returned new lessons. If armor around the tail worked, why not reinforce the belly? If steel was too heavy, maybe aluminum from crashed aircraft could be layered for lighter protection. There were no blueprints, only intuition and survival instinct. Mechanics began charting where bullets most often struck, marking each hit with chalk. Over time, patterns emerged: concentrated fire around the waist and tail. That data, drawn not from laboratories but from blood and experience, would soon change everything. The 8th Air Force's analysts, tasked with studying battle damage, began collecting this information officially. They realized something stunning: the areas showing the most bullet holes weren't necessarily the most dangerous, they were the parts that made it back. The planes that didn't return likely took hits to critical areas, the engines or cockpit, that left no survivors. From this grim calculus, a new science was born: survivorship bias. But for the crews, it wasn't an abstract theory, it was a map of where death lived. And they responded the only way they knew how: by layering more armor where it mattered, trusting experience over orders. The tension between innovation and regulation grew sharper. In February 1944, a letter circulated from headquarters warning against unauthorized field modifications that could compromise flight performance. To the men on the line, it sounded like bureaucracy talking from behind a desk 1,000 miles from danger. One sergeant scribbled on the notice, "Tell them to fly one of these damn things and see." Still, discipline mattered. Some officers feared that if command cracked down too hard, morale would break. Others quietly approved the changes under the table, pretending not to see. It was an unspoken understanding: better to have a slightly overweight bomber than an empty bunk. One freezing morning, at an airfield near Bassingbourn, a young engineer named Lieutenant Harold Peters watched a returning B-17 taxi in. Its tail was blackened, riddled with shrapnel, but intact. The crew climbed out shaken but alive. Peters examined the damage, running his hand over a welded steel plate. The shell had struck dead center and stopped cold. That moment stayed with him. He knew it wasn't luck. It was design, even if improvised. When Peters returned to Boeing's research division later that year, he carried those field photos and stories with him. They would become the seeds of a quiet revolution in bomber design. But for now, the men still flying didn't know that. All they knew was that tomorrow's mission was deeper, deadlier, and colder. And as night fell, the hangars glowed again with the light of welding torches. The war was teaching them something no classroom ever could: that survival was an art and necessity was the master instructor. Even as the rules tried to contain them, these men were redefining the very concept of what it meant to fight from the sky. They weren't just mechanics and pilots anymore. They were inventors of life in a place built for death. And soon, their defiance would reach the very heart of Boeing's design philosophy, forcing the company to admit that the truest armor had not come from Seattle, but from the frozen airfields of England. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe had reached its most brutal rhythm. Every dawn, the gray English skies filled with the roar of engines and the trembling of aluminum wings. The B-17s climbed in endless formations, their bellies heavy with bombs, their crews burdened with the knowledge that 1 out of every 5 wouldn't return. Each man had a ritual before takeoff: a silent handshake, a letter folded into a pocket, a glance at the patched armor plates welded by hand in the dark. For them, superstition and steel had fused into a single kind of faith. As the bombers crossed the channel, the thin contrails behind them stretched like ghostly signatures against the cold blue. Somewhere out there, German fighters waited, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, sleek and fast, circling like wolves. But this time something was different. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned that the tails of American bombers were no longer soft targets. When they attacked, they saw sparks erupt where cannon shells met unexpected resistance. The makeshift armor, rough, uneven, sometimes welded from tank scraps, was saving lives. On one mission over Schweinfurt, a formation of flying fortresses was ambushed mid-flight. A B-17 named Lucky Lass took direct hits to its tail section. The gunner was thrown against his armor plate but survived, bruised and bleeding. When they landed, the crew discovered 2 unexploded 20mm shells lodged in the steel plate salvaged from a destroyed tank. It had stopped what no engineer in Seattle had planned for. The mechanic who'd welded it there cried when he saw it. "I told them it'd work," he said quietly. Stories like that spread faster than orders. The culture of the bomber crews had shifted from compliance to creativity. Where command saw deviation, the men saw evolution. They shared ideas over cigarettes and coffee, drawing new configurations on scraps of paper, plates over hydraulic lines, doubled panels under the radio operator's seat, flexible armor made from layered aluminum. At the same time, Boeing's engineers were beginning to take notice in earnest. Reports from Europe filtered back through channels, often disguised as maintenance notes or damage assessments. The engineers pored over them, fascinated. It wasn't just the armor that intrigued them, it was the spirit behind it. Here were ordinary servicemen with limited tools, innovating under fire in ways the factory floor never could. In a quiet meeting room in Seattle, surrounded by blueprints and photographs, the Boeing team began sketching something new. A revised defensive configuration, based not on theoretical modeling, but on survival data gathered from the field. The concept would eventually feed into the evolution of the B-17G, the final and most battle-hardened variant of the Flying Fortress. Among its defining changes, heavier armor around the tail and waist, and a reworked tail gun position inspired directly by the modifications aircrews had invented themselves. The irony was not lost on them. What had begun as forbidden tinkering was now shaping the official design of America's most famous bomber. The field had taught the factory. Back in England, the men who inspired these changes were unaware that they were rewriting aviation history. To them, each night still smelled of oil and fear. They were only trying to make it home. But slowly the pattern of survival began to change. Those who had once watched their comrades fall in burning spirals were now landing battered but alive. The numbers didn't lie. Loss rates in modified units dropped significantly. Command, seeing the data, began to soften its stance. Instead of punishment, there came quiet encouragement. Continue field modifications where necessary, one memo read. That single line was a silent nod to the thousands of mechanics who had risked their careers to save lives. Still, every victory in innovation came with its price. Heavier bombers meant more strain on engines, longer takeoff runs, and increased fuel burn. Pilots had to adapt to sluggish climbs, gunner arcs shifted slightly off-center, and some crews found themselves juggling between protection and performance. The balance between weight and survival was delicate, but to most the choice was simple: live slower but live. During one mission over Berlin, a B-17 nicknamed Angel's Det returned with its fuselage shredded, its engines coughing black smoke. The crew had taken 17 hits, any one of which could have ended them. But the modified belly armor, patched together from 2 German half-track panels, had absorbed the worst. When they landed, their pilot stepped out, kissed the metal and whispered, "You brought us home." The ground crew later painted that phrase right on the plate itself. By now the war's tide was turning. Allied air superiority was growing, and the bombers that once flew as prey were becoming predators of the sky. Yet the scars of survival were everywhere. Each plate of armor told a story of fear, defiance, and hope. Some aircraft carried so many patches that they resembled mosaics of survival. One mechanic joked, "They're flying junkyards now." But deep down, everyone knew that those junkyards were the reason men were still breathing. When Boeing's updated B-17G arrived, the changes were clear: a strengthened frame, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a new tail turret that offered greater protection and visibility. For the first time, the machine reflected the men who flew it. Their field improvisations had become blueprints. Yet for the crews there was little time to reflect. The missions continued, relentless as ever. Over the Ruhr, Hamburg, Dresden, the sky remained a place of constant peril. Even with new armor and design upgrades, no flight was guaranteed. The Luftwaffe adapted, the flak intensified, and each sortie tested the limits of courage and endurance. Still, something profound had shifted in the psychology of these men. They had taken control of their fate, however small that control might be. The fortress was no longer just a symbol of industrial power, it had become an extension of human will. Every rivet, every weld, every scarred panel represented defiance in its purest form. And though the engineers back home would later claim credit for innovation, those who were there knew the truth. It wasn't the company that had reinvented the flying fortress, it was the crews who refused to die quietly. By the summer of 1944, as Allied bombers darkened the skies over occupied Europe, the legend of the B-17 was no longer just about firepower or range. It was about the men who transformed a machine of war into a vessel of survival, reshaping it with their own hands, their own fear, and their unbreakable spirit. The flying fortress had been reborn, not in the factories of Seattle, but in the frozen airfields of England, under the sparks of midnight welding torches, guided by the trembling hands of men who refused to surrender to the sky. And in the quiet that followed each mission, as the engines fell silent and the crews counted who made it back, the sound of hammers on steel still echoed, a reminder that invention in war was not born of luxury or safety, but of the desperate, beautiful will to live. By early 1945, the sound of war had begun to fade over Europe, but the memory of what those men had built, what they had survived, would never leave them. The B-17s that once thundered across the continent now sat in rows at quiet airfields, their patched skins dulled by frost and soot. Some bore hundreds of mission marks, others carried the names of fallen friends scrawled beside jagged weld lines. They looked battered, exhausted, almost human. For the surviving crews, each dent told a story. A tail gunner would run his fingers along the crude armor welded behind him and remember the day it saved his life. A mechanic would glance at a panel he'd bolted together from tank scrap and know that his midnight gamble had paid off. These were not just planes, they were testaments to the bond between man and machine, forged in fear and necessity. When Boeing engineers arrived to decommission the older bombers, they studied these field-modified aircraft in silence. Some took photographs, others sketched notes. They saw armor plates that didn't belong, control cables rerouted by improvisation, fuel lines shielded by engine parts. What they were looking at wasn't chaos, it was evolution written in metal. One engineer reportedly whispered, "They taught us more than we taught them." That sentiment became a quiet truth among designers. The post-war era of aviation would be shaped by lessons learned not in labs, but in muddy airstrips. The B-29, the B-50, and even the early jet bombers that followed all carried traces of those lessons. Modularity, redundancy, localized protection, and, above all, respect for the experience of the men who flew and maintained them. But for the air crews themselves, life after war was more complicated. Many returned home carrying the weight of what they had seen and built. Some went back to factories, others to farms, others tried to forget the roar of engines and the smell of burning fuel. Yet even in silence, the instinct to innovate, to adapt, remained. They had learned something fundamental. That survival was not just endurance, it was creation. In the years that followed, historians would marvel at the ingenuity of those wartime mechanics and pilots. But for the men who lived it, there was no mystique, no grand design. It was simple. They had no choice. Each weld was a prayer, each plate a plea for one more dawn. They didn't reinvent the bomber for glory. They did it because death had forced them to think differently. The irony of their defiance is that it became the foundation of modern aerospace design philosophy. Wartime improvisation turned into doctrine. Boeing's internal reports after 1945 formally credited field innovation as a critical source of survivability insights. In official documents, the tone was analytical, detached. But between the lines, you could feel the respect, the quiet acknowledgement that genius had come from the hangars, not the headquarters. Meanwhile, many of the patched-up B-17s were melted down, their steel reborn into the post-war boom, cars, bridges, even new aircraft. The metal that had once carried terrified young men across enemy skies now supported highways and cities across America. But in museums and air shows decades later, a few of those old fortresses still flew, their scars preserved like wrinkles of memory. You could see the uneven armor, the mismatched rivets, the proof of human hands that had refused to surrender. Visitors would look up at them and marvel at their strength, unaware that much of that strength had been welded in fear. The guides would tell stories of bravery and precision, of bomb runs and victory. But what they rarely said aloud was the deeper truth. that the flying fortress was a triumph not of engineering alone, but of human improvisation under unbearable pressure. The moral paradox lingered. The same creativity that saved lives also prolonged destruction. The same innovation that protected men from bullets enabled them to drop more bombs. Progress and pain had shared the same forge. And yet, within that paradox lay something undeniably human: the refusal to be passive, the instinct to build even in the midst of ruin. Years later, one surviving crew chief interviewed for a documentary looked at his photograph beside his old plane, patched, scarred, beautiful, and said quietly, "We weren't heroes. We were just trying to live. But I guess that's what heroes do sometimes." In those few words, he captured the essence of what the B-17 represented. Not just a weapon but a vessel of defiance, a canvas for human ingenuity painted in smoke and steel. Every rivet hammered in defiance of death. Every patch a story of men who, when ordered to stand still, chose to create instead. By the time peace finally came, the lesson of the flying fortress was etched deep into aviation history. Survival is not just endurance, it is adaptation, the art of reshaping the impossible into the barely possible. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the B-17 crews, the men who reinvented survival with scrap metal, who turned desperation into design, who proved that courage is not only in flying into battle, but in daring to change the machine beneath your hands. So the next time a vintage bomber crosses the sky, slow and graceful, gleaming in the sun, remember that it once carried the fingerprints of fear and hope on every plate. It was never just a fortress of aluminum and firepower, it was a testament to the idea that even in war, creation can emerge from chaos. And in that simple truth lies the enduring echo of every man who ever flew her. Those who welded through the night, those who prayed over their armor, and those who never made it home. They were not just part of the machine. They were the machine. If stories like this move you, if you believe that history is not just about battles but about the people who built their way through them, stay with us and subscribe. Because these are not just tales of war. They're reminders of what we're capable of when survival demands invention. And somewhere high above the quiet fields of Europe, the ghosts of those flying fortresses still drift in the cold air. Proof that even in the darkest moments of war, the human will to create never dies.